Park Seo-joon signed the deed to purchase the building. The paper transferred ownership to him. The cold language concealed a condemnation of someone else's business. Meanwhile, at the Sunsu restaurant, Kim Min-ji was putting the finishing touches on a plate. She was the daughter of her mother and former creditor, and she had given this place her all to escape her past. She didn't know that 3 days later, men in formal suits would walk through her door. She didn't know that her refusal to sell would ignite an uncontrollable intrigue in the new owner. Her decision to fight back would be the point of no return. And when he personally shows up on her kitchen doorstep, disguised as a client, a quiet dinner will change the rules of the game for both of them. The kitchen of the Sunsu restaurant was filled with the familiar noise. Minji quickly moved the frying pan in her hand, and the seafood flew into the air in a steady flame. "Chief, table number 3 is asking for more panchan," the waiter called, rushing past. "It's ready," Minji replied curtly, not looking up from the stove. "Tell the guests it's from our side." She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. The hall was full, but her face was serious. When the last order had gone to the guests, she approached a small altar with a photograph of a smiling woman in a simple dress. "We're holding on, Mom," she said quietly. "Just like always." Walking into the utility room, she opened her laptop. Bills were displayed on the screen. Rent, a loan for a new range hood, payments to suppliers. The numbers didn't add up. She sighed heavily and closed the lid. At that moment, her head waiter, Park, entered the kitchen. "Minji-si," he began hesitantly. "The man from the real estate agency called. He asked when you could meet about extending the lease. He says the terms could change significantly." Minji turned around abruptly. "What do you mean, change a lot? We have a contract." "I don't know." Park shrugged. "He said the owner was considering other offers. He asked you to contact him as soon as possible." "Okay," Minji said through clenched teeth. "I'll call tomorrow, but right now, work." She returned to the stove, gripping the knife handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The restaurant was her fortress. Her only inheritance from her mother, rested from a past full of debt and humiliation. She wouldn't give it up so easily. She didn't know that the other offer was Park Seo-joon, and that his decision was already final. The next day, in the afternoon, when the restaurant was quiet, the door opened. 2 men in impeccable dark suits entered. They didn't look like ordinary guests. "Good afternoon," said the eldest of them, politely but without a smile. "We would like to speak with the owner." Minji emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm the hostess. How can I help you?" The man introduced himself as Mr. Lee, his assistant. "We represent the new owner of this building. He wants me to convey to you his offer to buy your business. The price is more than fair." He handed Minji an envelope. She didn't even glance at it. "My restaurant is not for sale. I have a lease." Mr. Lee shook his head gently. "Unfortunately, the old contract was canceled with the transfer of ownership. The new owner is planning a major renovation. He's offering you a fair compensation so you can start your business elsewhere." "Start over?" Minji's voice grew sharp. "Sunsu isn't just a business. It's my family. My life. I'm not moving anywhere. Tell your boss I refuse." Mr. Lee's gaze grew colder. "I would advise you to carefully consider the offer, mistress. The situation could become complicated. The owner is a decisive man." "Me too," Minji replied firmly. "The answer is no. Now, if you're not going to place an order, I need to get to work." The men exchanged glances. Mr. Lee nodded slightly. "As you wish. You'll receive our contact information. Think about it. You have a week." When they left, a heavy silence fell over the restaurant. Waiter Park looked at Minji with concern. "What are we going to do, boss?" Minji squeezed the envelope in her hand, crumpling it. "What we always do, Park. Fight. I have no intention of closing myself off." She returned to the kitchen, but her calm was feigned. Thoughts raced through her head. Who was this new owner? And what would he do when he realized his persuasion was useless? Mr. Lai returned to his office, located on the top floor of one of the tallest buildings in the business district. He entered the room, where a man stood by the panoramic window, his back to the door. "Well?" Park Seo-joon asked without turning around. His voice was even, emotionless. "She refused, boss," Lee reported. "Absolutely. She says the restaurant is her family and her life." Seo-joon turned slowly. His face was calm, almost detached, but a spark of either interest or irritation flickered in his eyes. persistently. Despite the offered amount, she didn't even glance at the envelope. Seo-jun walked over to the desk and sat down in a chair. Files lay in front of him. Sunsu's financial report, Minji's credit report, a photo of the restaurant, and her brief profile. Stubbornness based on emotion is the most unprofitable asset, he said. But the building is perfect. Neutral territory, unassuming appearance, convenient logistics. I need this place. He leaned back in his chair, as Seo-jun wasn't used to being refused, especially in such small matters. He'd returned from Los Angeles to strengthen his father's empire in Asia, and every detail had to be perfect. Secret meetings with officials and partners required a completely legal, discreet setting. The ground floor, converted into a private club, was the perfect solution. Any leverage? He asked, looking at Lee. The restaurant is on the verge of closing due to debt, rent, loans to suppliers. She's the only one who owns it. Her mother is dead. Her father disappeared. Okay, Seo-jun nodded. Buy out all her debts through shell companies. Make me her main and only creditor. And after that, Lee clarified. After that, Seo-jun looked out the window at the evening city. She'll get another offer. Only this time it won't be an offer. It'll be a fact. There was no malice in his tone, only cold, unerring calculation. He was used to getting what he wanted. This small restaurant and its stubborn owner were just another problem to be solved. Quickly and efficiently. He didn't yet know that he would soon face this challenge head-on, and that the simplicity of her food would prove more complex than all his schemes. Boss, there's one more thing, Mr. Lee said, still shifting the folder in his hands. Lee Ha-jun is waiting in the reception area. He wants to report on the situation with deliveries from the port of Incheon. Seo-jun sighed slightly. He nodded. A young man of about 25 entered the office. Lee Ha-jun. He held himself with feigned respect, but his gaze betrayed ambition. Boss, everything's settled, he reported. The new route is working. No prying eyes. Okay, Seo-jun replied shortly. Make sure it stays that way. Ha-jun paused, casting a cautious glance at the photographs of Sunsu laid out on the table. Is this about the new meeting place? He asked, trying to sound simply interested. Seo-jun leaned back in his chair, studying his lieutenant. Yes, this is the perfect spot. Quiet, legal, no unnecessary attention, but there's a small problem with the current tenant. Got it, Ha-jun nodded, a hint of thought flickering in his eyes. If you need a more convincing argument, my guys can help. Quickly and quietly. Seo-jun looked at him coldly. It was precisely this approach, rude and loud, that he had tried to eradicate upon coming to power. No, Ha-jun, we are not street thugs. We are a business. Problems are solved through economic leverage, not fists. Understood? Of course, boss, Ha-jun quickly agreed, but there was a slight resentment in his bow. I just wanted to help. Your help is needed at the port? Go. Seo-jun looked away, clearly indicating the conversation was over. After Ha-jun left, Seo-jun stared at the closed door for a moment. He'd inherited his father's organization, rough, brutal, and visible. His task was to make it invisible, to weave it into the fabric of legitimate business. Every misstep, every overstep, like Ha-jun's suggestion, set him back. This woman, Kim Min-ji, with her restaurant, was now the most insignificant, yet most irritating obstacle on this path. But he decided to do things his own way, cleanly and ruthlessly. After Ha-jun left, Mr. Lee turned to Seo-jun again. Regarding the building, boss, the management company confirmed that after the debt was bought out, we have the right to terminate any lease unilaterally. The building is legally clear. Excellent, Seo-jun said, standing and walking over to the map of the area hanging on the wall. He pointed to a spot. There it is. Sungsu. Perfect. Quiet street, good access, but not pretentious. No one will notice the cars outside a modest restaurant. He turned to Lee. I don't want to just throw her out into the street. That will raise questions. I need the place to continue operating as a restaurant. But just for us, complete privacy. A kitchen capable of feeding 20 people without unnecessary noise. And a hostess who will see but not hear. Or pretend not to hear. Are you thinking about her? Lee clarified. She's committed to her cause. That means she's a fighter. And she's desperate. Desperation is the best glue, Seo-jun stated coldly. We'll be her only lifeline. She'll hate us, but she'll work. And hatred is easy to control. His plan was simple and cruel. First, a complete financial blockade, the redemption of all her debts, then the official notice of termination of the lease agreement. And when she hits rock bottom, an offer comes. Not a buyout, but keeping the restaurant on new terms. His terms. He looked at the photograph of Sun Tzu's modest facade. For him, it wasn't a restaurant, but an asset, a well-placed square on a chessboard. And he was about to make his move. Start with the debts, he gave the final order. Everyone's. I want her to owe money only to me within a week. Understood? Understood, boss. Mr. Lee nodded, making a note. The plan was set. The target was determined. All that remained was to wait for the trapped bird to stop banging against the glass and calm down. A few days later, Seo Jun's plan began to take shape. Minji received an official registered letter from the new management company, Amrit. In dry legalese, it announced the unilateral termination of the lease and ordered her to vacate the premises within 30 days. She stood in the middle of the empty afternoon room, clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hands. There was no one to call. Her lawyer, having learned the name of the company that owned the case, politely declined to handle it, citing a busy schedule. At that moment, the restaurant's phone rang. Minji automatically picked it up. Hello? Ms. Kim? Said a polite male voice. This is Cheonghua Bank. We remind you that the equipment loan is due the day after tomorrow. The full amount must be deposited into the account by the end of the business day. I understand. I'm having some difficulties. Minji's voice trembled treacherously. We're sorry, but deferments are not possible. In the event of non-payment, we will be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings, including an inventory of the restaurant's assets. Have a nice day. The phone rang. Minji hung up. The calls came pouring in. The seafood supplier was demanding payment for the last 3 months. The garbage removal company was threatening to cancel the contract. She understood. This was no accident. They were deliberately putting pressure on her. In his office, Seo Jun, looking at the report on the debts purchased, gave his final instructions to Mr. Lee. 30 days is too long. We need to speed things up, send our man to the health inspectorate, have them conduct an unscheduled inspection, and contact the tax office. I'm sure a small business like this will find some inaccuracies. He spoke calmly, as if talking about the weather. I want her to understand. Every door is closed to her, every one. There will only be one left, the one we open. Finally, irritated by her stubbornness and his own curiosity, Seo Jun decided to see the cause of all these problems with his own eyes. He arrived at Sunsa that evening alone, without an entourage. Wearing a simple dark sweater and no watch, he tried to look like an ordinary, albeit wealthy guest. The room smelled of broth and something homemade. He took a corner table. Minji, pale and focused, brought him the menu herself. She barely glanced at him. Her thoughts were out there in the pile of papers in the back room. Any of the house specials? She asked, trying to keep her voice even. What do you recommend? He asked, studying her face. Tired, but with a firm chin. Nakpap, a classic dish, everything fresh. He nodded. When a plate of steaming rice with vegetables and beef appeared in front of him, he frowned. Nothing special. Simple food. He tried it, and he froze. The taste was deep, clear, perfectly balanced. A taste he hadn't experienced since childhood, before his life had become a chain of calculations and cold deals. A taste that, for some reason, brought to mind a blurred image of a woman. Not his mother, but the nanny who fed him in a large empty house. He finished it all, down to the last grain. The irritation had vanished. It was replaced by a strange, almost unfamiliar feeling. Respect. This woman, cornered, brought an honesty to her simple work that was absent from his entire impeccable but empty life. He caught her eye as she took away her empty plate. Delicious, he said quietly, and it wasn't polite. Really? Minji met his eyes briefly, nodded in surprise, and quickly retreated back to the kitchen. She didn't recognize him as an enemy. And he, sitting at the table, realized that his cold, calculated plan had just given way. The problem, instead of being legal, had suddenly become very, very personal. He paid cash, leaving a sum considerably higher than the bill, and stepped out into the cool evening. But instead of getting into his car, Seo Jun parked in the shade in front of his own building. Through the restaurant window, he saw Minji, having finished with the guests, turn off the lights in the dining room and remain in the kitchen. She sat at the table, her head resting on her folded hands. Her shoulders shook slightly. This sight, her quiet despair, should have given him satisfaction. It was a sign that the pressure was working. Instead, something in his chest tightened unpleasantly. He turned away abruptly. At that moment, a security guard approached him, keeping a respectful distance. "Boss, is everything okay?" "Everything is according to plan," Seo-jun snapped, his voice becoming icy and even once again. Everything personal was discarded in a split second. "Tomorrow morning, send Mr. Lee to her. Have him convey a new proposal, not by letter, in person." "What offer, boss?" "An offer you can't refuse." Seo-jun took a last look at the illuminated kitchen window. "We won't evict her restaurant. We'll be her only customer, her only employer, the only reason for this place to exist. She'll cook for our meetings, keep a low profile. Her restaurant will remain hers, but she herself will become ours." He got into the car. His face was stony in the streetlights. A fleeting weakness, evoked by a taste of childhood, was recognized as a mistake. A dangerous one. Mistakes in his world were costly, and he would correct this mistake by bringing its source under his complete control. Cruel, but effective. "Let's go," he ordered the driver, and the car silently pulled away, disappearing into the night traffic. The trap was ready to snap shut. The next morning, Minji was sitting at the counter, staring at a stack of bills when the door opened. Mr. Lee walked in. He was alone, but his appearance filled the room with the same sense of inevitability. "Ms. Kim," he nodded, placing a thick envelope on the counter. "I've brought you an offer, on behalf of the owner." "I don't want to see him," Minji said quietly, not looking at him. "Then let me get to the point." His tone remained polite. "The owner is impressed with your skills. He's offering you a unique opportunity to save Sunsu. The restaurant will be closed to the public, but you will remain as head chef. You will cook exclusively for him and his business partners, on designated days, in complete silence and privacy." Minji looked at him with hatred. "Become a cook for the Mafia? Is this a joke?" "It's the only alternative to losing everything," Mr. Lee stated coldly. "Your debts have been paid off. The lease has been rewritten. All the leverage is now in his hands. You can sign this contract and continue working in your kitchen. Or you can refuse, and in 3 days there will be an inventory of this place before the auction." He moved the envelope slightly. "The contract stipulates generous compensation, but the key clause is non-disclosure. We take confidentiality seriously, very seriously." Minji was silent. Images flashed through her mind. Her mother in the kitchen, her first homemade soup, the laughter of her guests. And then, the faces of the debt collectors, the empty hall, the inventory of property. "Why me?" she breathed. "Why my restaurant?" "Strategic location," Lee answered honestly. "And the owner's personal interest in your talent. He tried your food. It made an impression." Having said this, Mr. Lee took a step back. "Until the end of the day, don't try to seek help. Anyone you contact works for us. Any lawyer will turn you down. Any official won't find your documents. The choice is simple. Work under the new rules or lose everything." He left. Minji slowly tore open the envelope. Her gaze slid over the lines. It was as he had said, a slave contract masquerading as a legal agreement. She clenched the paper in her fist. Sunsu was her life, the only thing left of her mother and her own struggle. Giving it up would be death, but signing this meant selling her soul. She glanced at her mother's photograph on the wall. She looked at her with quiet sadness. Minji didn't sleep all night. At dawn, she picked up her pen. Her fingers trembled, but the signature on the contract was clear and legible. She hadn't sold the restaurant. She had sold her freedom to preserve its walls. Within a few hours, changes began. People arrived and installed a new reinforced door in the utility room, leading to a small, closed-off room. They brought luxurious tableware and expensive cutlery, all without a single logo. Minji watched silently as her family's place was transformed into a private dining room for other people's shady dealings. Mr. Lee arrived that evening. He handed her the first sealed envelope. "Tomorrow at 20 Kriye, menu inside, food will be delivered in the morning. You prepare and serve through the hatch. Do not enter the dining room. Clean up after guests leave. Any questions?" "No," Minji answered curtly. "That's the correct answer," Lee nodded. "And remember, Failure to comply with the terms, lateness, or any breach of confidentiality will result in immediate termination of the contract, with all the consequences. The night before the first meal, Minji cooked. She chopped vegetables with such fury that it resembled an attack. Every stroke of the knife was a blow to an invisible enemy. She used chili pepper not for balance, but for searing aggression. She brewed the broth not with love, but with cold, concentrated anger. It was her only possible form of protest at that moment. At precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, several men entered the restaurant. She saw him, Seo-jun, and her body tensed. It was that same guest, the one who had been sitting alone and praising her knockbang. But now he walked in the center of the group. His face was calm and cold. He looked at her, and there was no hint of that past approval in his gaze, only emptiness and control. Then he walked into the hall, not looking again. The door closed. Minji understood. His last visit hadn't been a coincidence. He'd come to check her and her restaurant out personally, to evaluate them like merchandise. The feeling of being cheated hit her like a slap in the face. She spun sharply toward the stove. Her movements became harder and faster. As she served the dishes, her thoughts were clear. He wasn't just an enemy. He was an enemy who had toyed with her, and now he owned her. At some point, while wiping down the now clean countertop, she heard his voice from behind the door, low and confident. That's why supplies need to be moved through the port of Busan. The old routes have become too transparent. She froze. This wasn't just a dinner. This was a meeting where destinies were being decided. When the guests left, Seo-jun walked into the kitchen alone. His gaze fell on her face, frozen in a mask of alienation. "Spicy," he said, referring to one of the dishes. "Very spicy, almost provocative." "It's in the recipe," Minji snapped, looking past him. "Of course," a hint of something like mockery entered his voice. "Next time, Ms. Kim, add a little less heat to the sauce. My partners are conservative people. They need predictability, just like me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You've done a wonderful job. The restaurant is yours. As long as you keep doing it. Clear, quiet, and predictable." He left. The deal had worked. He got everything he wanted: territory, control, and a talented chef whose will had been broken by necessity. She kept Sunsa, but every brick in its walls now reminded her of the price. The following weeks became a ritual. Minji cooked to his orders with impeccable precision, but without soul. She became a ghost in her own kitchen, silent, efficient, invisible. She no longer looked at her guests' faces, nor heard snatches of conversation. She existed between the stove and the sink. Seo-jun came often, sometimes with guests, sometimes alone. When he was alone, he often ordered that same dish, tukbap, and he always ate it all. He stopped commenting on the spiciness. He simply sat in that room and ate. And then he would go out to the kitchen and leave on the table an amount several times higher than the bill. Silently. It wasn't payment. It was a gesture of power. A reminder, I can even buy your silence. One evening, after he'd left, Minji discovered he'd left behind more than just money. On the corner of the desk lay a small, rare bottle of wild lemon oil, an ingredient she'd once angrily told her assistant was impossible to obtain. Impulsively, she tossed the bottle into the trash. He had no right to intrude on her professional dreams. The next morning, when she arrived, the bottle was standing on her desk. Next to it was a simple note with one word written in her neat handwriting: wasteful. That evening, she added the oil to his dinner sauce. But along with it, she added a handful of Sichuan peppercorns, which produced not a spiciness, but a strange, temporary numbness. Let him feel that he wasn't in control. He ate everything. When he walked into the kitchen, his eyes watered from the unusual effect, but his lips were firmly pressed together. "An interesting experiment, Ms. Kim," he said, and for the first time his voice sounded not irritated, but rather like a respectful challenge. "But next time, no surprises, or I'll think you're trying to poison the client." But he came back 2 days later and again ordered a knock-on delivery. The standoff continued. Minji began using seasonal ingredients with maximum pungency. Green persimmons, unripe plums, ginger root so pungent it burned the throat. She wasn't breaking the contract. She was simply pushing the limits of acceptable flavor. Seo-jun took it as a challenge. He ate everything without comment, but his visits became more frequent. Sometimes he'd order dinner for one, just sit and eat in complete silence, and then leave, leaving money on the table. One day, after a particularly aggressive dinner where every ingredient seemed to scream, he didn't leave right away. He went into the kitchen and stood looking at her back while she washed the dishes. "You're trying to get on my nerves," he stated evenly. "I'm cooking under contract," she replied without turning around. "You cook with hatred. It's noticeable. You want me to feel it." Minji spun around, still clutching the metal sponge. "Do you feel it?" "Yes," he answered honestly. "And that's what makes food interesting, alive. In my world, everything has long been dead and predictable, even threats." The admission seemed to escape him against his will. He frowned, as if he'd caught himself in a mistake. "But that doesn't change the rules," he added, his voice firm again. "You're still my employee, and I'm still your only client. Don't cross the line." He left. Minji remained standing. There was no threat in his words. There was something else, almost a confession, and that angered her even more. It was easier for her to hate a monster, harder, a man who saw something valuable in her hatred. His next order was simple: clear chicken noodle soup with green onions. A simple, basic, almost childish dish. There was no room for sneak attacks, just pure skill. Minji cooked it perfectly. The broth was crystal clear and fragrant, the noodles springy. When he tasted it, he closed his eyes for a second. No words, just a nod. And this time, he didn't leave any money. He left an old tattered book of Korean recipes on the table, seemingly 100 years old. There was something written on the flyleaf in a child's handwriting, but the ink had rubbed off. But from the moment he left that book, something broke. The Cold War cracked, and through it, Minji was forced to step into Park Seo-joon's real world. A few days later, Mr. Lee handed her not just a menu, but an order. The next dinner would be held not at Sunsu, but at Mr. Park's private residence. She was to arrive with her knives and an assistant by 6 in the evening. She was taken to a gated community on the outskirts of Seoul. Seo-joon's mansion was modern, minimalist, and cold, like a bunker. Cameras were everywhere. Men in simple but expensive clothes silently patrolled the grounds. The air was still and tense. She was led into a kitchen larger than her entire restaurant. All the equipment was state-of-the-art, silent, and sterile. It didn't smell of food. It smelled of money and control. That evening, she cooked like a robot. Through a large one-sided panel, she could see the dining room. Several people were seated at the table. Their faces were impassive, their postures unnaturally relaxed. She recognized one, a former prosecutor whose face often appeared in the news. Another was a major developer. They spoke quietly, and Seo-joon sat at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice, but his every word made the others listen intently. They discussed quotas, land, resolving issues with intractable officials. No overt threats, only hints, figures, quiet agreements that meant more than shouting. At that moment, the kitchen door opened. Lee Ha-joon entered. He paused and stared at Minji for a long moment, his gaze both appraising and hostile. "So, this is our secret chef," he said, a hint of mockery in his voice. "Make yourself comfortable, Ms. Kim. You're part of the family now. Just remember, in a family, you know your place. And don't look where you shouldn't." He left, leaving behind a sense of menace more palpable than Seo-joon's. Minji realized that the dangers she felt here weren't merely abstract. They had faces. After the guests left, Seo-joon walked into the kitchen. He looked tired. "It was good today. Thank you." "Your man, Ha-joon," Minji suddenly said, unable to restrain herself. "He told me to know my place." Seo-joon slowly looked up at her. "Lee Ha-joon is my lieutenant. He's jealous of the hierarchy. Ignore him. Your place is here at the stove. It's the only place that concerns you. Remember that." But his tone lacked the former uncompromisingness. There was weariness, and in this lay a new, deeper danger. She saw more than just a boss. She saw a man trapped in a gilded cage of power and fear, just as she was trapped in her kitchen, and that thought was more terrifying than any direct threat. She remained silent, suppressing a strange impulse to offer him tea or simply walk away, leaving him alone. But she couldn't leave. This was his territory. "I must be a rock for them," he continued, still looking out the window. "Unfeeling and reliable. Any crack is a weakness. And weakness has a price here. It's bought and sold. Do you understand?" He turned and looked straight at her. That's why your place at the stove isn't a punishment, Ms. Kim. It's the safest zone in this entire circus. You're cooking. You're not bargaining. Appreciate that. There was no condescension in his words. It was a bitter statement of fact. He envied her simple, clear function. She suddenly realized that his power was not only control over others, but also a prison for himself. And he had long ago thrown away the key to this prison. "And you?" she asked unexpectedly. "Have you ever eaten something just because you wanted it, and not because it was necessary for the task?" He stared at her as if she'd asked a question in an unknown language. Then his gaze fell on the empty plate. "Today," he finally said. "And then, at your restaurant." He pushed away from the counter and the mask slid back onto his face, but now it looked more fragile. "Mr. Lee will take you back tomorrow, and yes, about Ha-Jun. He's dangerous. Stay away from him. This isn't a request. It's an order." He walked out, leaving her alone in the vast, shining kitchen. She glanced at his empty plate. The danger no longer came solely from the threat of closing Sunsu. Now the danger was that she was beginning to see him as a person, and in his world, that was a fatal weakness, for both of them. Returning to Sunsu brought no relief. Now Minji saw shadows even in her safe space. And after a few days, the shadow took shape. Lee Ha-Jun came into her restaurant. He was alone, wearing an expensive leather jacket, and looked at the decor with obvious disdain. "Cozy?" he said, not hiding his sarcasm. "A real family nest, just like in the movies." "How can I help you?" Minji asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Oh, I don't need anything. I'm just checking the boss's assets, making sure everything is in order. You're a valuable resource now, aren't you?" He paced the room, running his finger along the tabletop and examining the dust. "It's strange," he continued. "The boss doesn't usually keep outsiders so close to the matter, especially such emotional ones. You know what I mean?" "I'm just cooking," Minji replied firmly. "Really?" Ha-Jun stopped in front of her. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I think you're cooking something more. The boss has started dining alone a lot, and not just anywhere, but here. It's a luxury he rarely allows himself. Distractions are a no-no for him." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've been with him for years. I know what he needs. And he doesn't need some ambitious, debt-ridden cook to ruin his concentration. We're all cogs in a machine. And when one cog starts to think it's special, it gets replaced. Quickly and quietly. Understood?" The threat hung in the air, thick and unambiguous. This wasn't Seo Jun's cold pressure. This was a personal, almost animalistic hostility. "I'm fulfilling the terms of the contract," Minji said, feeling her fingers grow cold. "Fine," Ha-Jun said, his voice falsely cheerful. "Then let's continue. You in your kitchen, the boss on his throne, and I'll make sure order isn't disturbed, for the greater good." He left, leaving behind a heavy, toxic atmosphere. Minji realized Ha-Jun saw her not just as an employee, but as a threat to his position, his influence. And such an enemy was more dangerous than a faceless organization. He was specific, jealous, and ready to remove obstacles. From that moment on, Ha-Jun became her shadow. He didn't appear in person every day, but his presence was felt. One morning, her main seafood supplier called apologetically, saying he could no longer work with Sunsu. No explanation was given. The next day, the vegetable truck from the trusted farmer didn't arrive. When Minji called, she was politely told that all the produce was now reserved for other customers. She had to find new suppliers. Prices were higher, quality was lower. She wasted precious time and energy on this. One day, when Sojun arrived for dinner alone, she couldn't stand it any longer as she was serving soup. "I'm having problems with supplies. My old partners are refusing to work." He looked up at her. "This is a business city. Competition." "It's not competition," she said bluntly. "It's sabotage." Seojun slowly put down his spoon. "Do you have proof?" "No, just apologetic calls and skyrocketing bills." He paused, then nodded. "I'll look into it." But the pressure didn't stop. A couple of days later, her assistant, the elderly Mr. Park, didn't show up for work. When Minji reached him by phone, his wife, crying, said he'd slipped on the stairs and broken his arm. "It's strange," she added. "He was always so careful. And it was so wet down there, It was as if someone had spilled oil on purpose. Minji had no doubt it was on purpose. This was no longer a hidden hint, but a direct shot into the air. Warning, the next hit might be more accurate. She worked alone, torn between the slabs, gritting her teeth with fatigue and anger. Now she feared not only for the restaurant. She began to fear for the people around her. Ha-jun methodically cut her off from everything that made her work and life stable. He made it clear to her, her safety was an illusion. It existed only as long as he, Ha-jun, deemed it convenient, and his patience was thinner than his boss's. Ha-jun's constant, smoldering threat broke the last barriers of formality between them. Minji was on the verge of breaking down, working alone, and Seo-jun saw it. One evening, he arrived earlier than usual and found her trying to drag a heavy sack of rice into the utility room by herself. "Let me help," he said, and without waiting for an answer, he took the sack from her hands. He carried it back and put it back, then, without looking at her, asked, "Is your assistant still in the hospital?" "Yes," she answered, catching her breath. "They told him he wasn't allowed to do any heavy lifting." "I'll find you a temporary one," he snapped. "No," Minji said unexpectedly sharply. "Don't. Your temporary person will also break his leg later. I can handle it myself." Seo-jun stopped and turned to face her. There was no anger in his eyes, only understanding. "It's Ha-jun, right?" "Who else?" She took off her apron and threw it forcefully on the table. "He cut me off from my suppliers. He scared my assistant. What's next? Set the restaurant on fire?" Seo-jun paused, looking at her hands shaking with impotent rage. "He's jealous," he finally said, and his voice held a tired frankness that hadn't been there before. "He's been around for years. He believes he's entitled to exclusive trust. Your appearance, he perceives as a threat to his position." "What can you do about it?" she asked, looking him straight in the eye. "So far, almost nothing," he admitted honestly. "He's too valuable, he knows too much, and too many in the organization respect him. Open conflict now would be costly." This admission of his relative weakness to his own subordinate was a turning point. He wasn't an all-powerful boss at that moment. He was a man trapped in the clutches of his own system. "Why did you come back then?" Minji asked suddenly. "From Los Angeles. You could have stayed there." He looked away, looking somewhere into the past. "Because it's an inheritance from my father, his empire, his duty, his prison. To run away would be to betray his memory and admit that his whole life, and mine along with it, was a mistake." He said it simply, without pathos. And in this simplicity lay a terrible truth. He was a prisoner, just like her. His cell was simply more luxurious. That night he dined later than usual. And Minji cooked without anger, just food. As he was leaving, he turned around at the threshold. "Be careful, I'll talk to him, but that's no guarantee." "I know," she answered quietly. Ha-jun's danger, becoming their shared secret, involuntarily brought them closer. Seo-jun began to linger more often after dinner, sometimes simply sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea while Minji finished work. A conversation about his father and duty broke the first crack in the wall between them. One evening, as the rain pounded the roof of Sunsu, he asked her, "What about your mother? You said she built this place from scratch. How did she cope when things were unbearably difficult?" Minji, wiping the table, thought for a moment. "She said that when the kitchen is hot from the stove and smells of food, the outside world retreats. There are different rules here. Either you control the fire and the salt, or they control you." It was her form of control over a life that expected nothing from her. "Control," Seo-jun repeated quietly. "Yes, I understand that." At that moment, they were simply two people who found a common thread in each other. But beyond the restaurant's walls, a blow was already being prepared for their fragile truce. Lee Ha-jun watched. He saw the boss's car linger outside Sunsu's for longer and longer, the usual cold tension in his shoulders fading after these visits. For Ha-jun, who had built his career on years of absolute loyalty and helpfulness, this wasn't just an annoyance. It was a direct threat. If the boss began to see this woman as more than just a cook, then his advice, his role as right-hand man, would become worthless. He decided to act not like a brutal thug, but like a strategist. He needed an indisputable fact that would destroy trust once and for all. He began digging into Minji's past, looking for any weakness, and he found it in her mother's old financial records. Several years ago, when Minji's mother was dying of illness and debts were mounting, a large money transfer was made through the restaurant's account. The source was an elderly supplier, Mr. An. The money was disguised as a donation. At first glance, it seemed like an act of kindness, but Ha-jun, who knew all the old connections in Seoul's business world, discovered something else. Mr. An was a distant relative of the Park family, Seo-jun's family. Moreover, this An later invested in a business that competed with the Park clan's interests and was ruined. Coincidence? Perhaps. But for anyone looking for a conspiracy, here was the perfect picture. Enemy money, transferred in a moment of weakness to a future agent, embedded in the very heart of the empire. Ha-jun collected copies of the translations, extracts, found Mr. An himself, now a broken and frightened old man, and convinced him to give the required testimony. He compiled a perfect, simple dossier. Facts, dates, connections. No emotion, only the irrefutable logic of betrayal. He chose the moment when Seo-jun returned from a difficult, unsuccessful meeting, irritated and tired. The perfect moment to doubt those he considered close. Ha-jun entered the office with a folder in his hands, his face worried and serious. "Boss, I apologize for disturbing you, but I've discovered something that can't wait. It concerns Kim Minji. I think you've been misled." "Go on," Seo-jun said, not looking at him, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Ha-jun placed the folder in front of him and opened it to the first page, a bank transfer printout. Several years ago, when her mother was dying and the restaurant was on the brink of bankruptcy, Kim Min-ji received a large sum, a donation, from Mr. An, the seafood supplier. Seo-jun was silent. His fingers stopped moving. "Mr. An is a distant relative of the Park family," Ha-jun continued, emphasizing the words. "And also, as you may remember, he later financed that transportation business in Incheon that tried to steal our contracts. We destroyed it. An went bankrupt." Now Seo-jun looked up at him. His eyes were narrow slits. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she took money from someone connected to our enemies, at her most vulnerable moment. And then, years later, she showed up in your lives, stubbornly refused to sell the restaurant, forcing you to pay attention to her, gained access to your private meetings, and all this time, she never mentioned her connection to An. Why?" Seo-jun slowly flipped through the pages. There was evidence, An's own testimony, signed and notarized, confirming the transfer of money and his concern for Minji's future. Everything was neat, logical, and terribly plausible. "She might not have known about his connections," Seo-jun said, but his voice was already hollow, like an echo of his own doubts. "Do you really believe that, boss?" Ha-jun asked softly. "She grew up in this business. Her mother knew all the suppliers by sight. And this amount? This isn't a small donation. It's an investment. An investment that paid off when she gained your trust." The word trust sounded like a death sentence. Seo-jun leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Her eyes appeared before him, now full of hatred, now tired, now softened during their rare moments of conversation. It could all be a game. Everything he was beginning to sense could be a carefully planned manipulation. After a day full of betrayals and cold calculations, this thought was the easiest and most painful to accept. "That's enough," he said hoarsely. "Get out." Ha-jun, hiding a triumphant smile, bowed and left. He knew he had sown the seed. Now, he only had to wait for the poison of doubt to do its work. The poison of doubt took effect immediately. Seo-jun canceled his next visit to Sunsu without explanation. Mr. Lee provided a set dinner order for business partners, a precise menu with no room for improvisation. No personal requests, no conversations afterwards. Minji felt an icy change. The air around her restaurant thickened again, but this time the chill came not from an external threat, but from within itself. She tried to convince herself it was simply being busy, but her instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed danger. The denouement came 3 days later. Late that evening, as she was turning out the lights, it wasn't Mr. Lee who entered the restaurant, but Seo-jun himself. His face was pale and hard as granite. Behind him, in a respectful pose but with a glint in his eyes, stood Ha-jun. "Get out," Seo-jun said curtly to his lieutenant. He nodded and retreated through the door, leaving them alone in the dim light of the hall. Minji froze, still holding the front door key. "What happened?" "Mr. An, he blurted out, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. Does the name sound familiar? Minji paled. She hadn't expected to hear that name here and now. He was my mother's supplier. He helped us when you needed money, he finished for her. Big money. From a man who financed a business hostile to my family. And you hid it from me. All these months. I wasn't hiding it, she cried, feeling the floor shift beneath her feet. I just didn't think it was important. It was help. He was kind to my mother. Or was he investing in the future? Seo Jun's voice became a dangerous whisper. Investing in you? So that you'd be here, next to me, at the right moment? It's too convenient a coincidence, Minji. Too perfect a story about a poor cook in debt. He came closer, and she saw not only anger but also pain in his eyes. Pain from what he felt like he'd been deceived. I started trusting you, he hissed. And what did you do? Report to them? Tell them what you heard outside the door? No. Her own scream echoed in the empty room. Tears of anger and resentment welled up in her eyes. I hated every day here. But I only held on to this restaurant for my mother's memory, not for you and not for your enemies. And where's the evidence? He asked coldly. Where's the proof that you're not lying now? It's just your words against the facts. And the facts? He pointed toward the door where Hajun was waiting. Speak of betrayal. He took a step back, his expression completely closed. It's over. The contract is terminated. Tomorrow they'll come here and seal the restaurant for the debts, which, let me remind you, are still yours. You have nothing to do with this anymore. And if you value your life and freedom, his gaze turned icy, you will disappear. Forever. Don't try to contact me or approach my people. I won't be so lenient a second time. He turned and walked out, slamming the door. With the final click of the lock, absolute, all-consuming silence descended on Sun Tzu. Minji slowly sank to the floor. She wasn't crying. She simply sat, hugging her knees, staring into the darkness at the counter where he'd once left that old recipe book. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd sacrificed, destroyed with a single stroke of a pen and a handful of falsehoods. She was left with nothing. Only the bitter realization that for him, she'd always been just a passing fancy. So easy to believe the worst. Devastated, Minji left Sun Tzu that same night with just one bag. The restaurant was sealed the next day. She disappeared, renting a cheap room on the outskirts, trying to remain a shadow. Her world shrank to four walls and memories that burned within her. Meanwhile, Ha-jun celebrated his victory. The threat had been eliminated. The boss was cool and focused on business once again, and his own position seemed irreplaceable. But that wasn't enough. Having eliminated Minji, he saw a new opportunity to weaken Seo Jun himself. Discontent was brewing within the organization. Some of the old bosses from his father's time considered Seo Jun too soft, too Western, too cautious. Ha-jun began to approach them cautiously. He didn't speak out against the boss. He simply lamented, the boss was so strong until he got distracted by that woman. Or, it's a shame he doesn't trust anyone anymore, not even his old friends. Or, the decision about Incheon Port was risky. But who am I to doubt it? He used the Minji incident as proof of Seo Jun's weakness and lapses in judgment. He argued that if he could make such a mistake with a simple cook, how could anyone trust his strategic decisions? Gradually, drop by drop, the poison of doubt seeped into the organization's ranks. Ha-jun began laying the groundwork for a coup. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a strong ally within and the perfect moment. That moment was to be a major deal to ship a shipment of goods through a new, untested route. A risky but potentially lucrative plan, lobbied for by Seo Jun himself. Ha-jun publicly supported it, but quietly plotted a sabotage. He contacted a small but greedy rival gang operating on the outskirts of their territory. His proposal was simple. They would intercept the cargo during transit, creating the appearance of a rival attack. In exchange, they would receive a share of the goods, and Ha-jun would be irrefutable proof of Seo Jun's failure and incompetence. A failure that would cost the organization millions and destroy the last vestiges of trust in the boss. The plan was insidious. Even if Seo Jun suspected something was wrong, the blame would be placed on competitors or information leaks. Anything but his loyal lieutenant. And when the organization was on the brink of disintegration, Ha-jun would emerge as the savior, the one forced to take the reins to stop the chaos. He stood by the window in his office, looking out over the city at night. Minji was just a pawn, removed from the board. The real game, for the throne, was just beginning. And he was certain that the next few moves would make him king. Everything was ready. The deal was due in 5 days. Ha-jun acted with surgical precision. He pitted two minor bosses against each other to distract attention and strengthened his alliance with the disgruntled elders by promising them a larger percentage of future operations. Seo-jun, however, was withdrawn. After his breakup with Minji, he had become even more withdrawn and ruthless. He conducted business mechanically, relying on old patterns. His renowned intuition seemed dulled. Guilt and anger clouded his vision. He saw the displeased glances, but chalked them up to ordinary friction. He didn't see the snake right at the throne. 3 days before the deal, 2 key events occurred. First, one of Seo-jun's old loyal drivers, the man who had driven his father, approached him after a meeting. "Boss," he said quietly, looking around, "be careful with Ha-jun. He's been meeting with Kim from the Port Authority too often, and these meetings aren't business. My nephew works there," he saw. Seo-jun sighed wearily. "Thank you for telling me, but Ha-jun is negotiating new routes. That's his job." The driver wanted to add something, but saw the boss's closed expression and merely bowed. The warning was ignored. Second, Minji, in her closet, saw a local news report about the sharp rise in seafood prices due to logistics disruptions. The announcer mentioned that the main problems were expected at the Busan port next week, the very same date she'd overheard from behind the door many weeks ago. Her heart sank. This was his plan, the one he'd talked about. And if something went wrong, it would come back to haunt him. She turned off the TV, sat on the bed, and buried her face in her hands. He'd thrown her out, accused her of betrayal, taken everything. She should have hated him and rejoiced at his possible downfall. But instead, a cold, rational fear gripped her. She knew Ha-jun. If Seo-jun fell, he wouldn't stop. He'd find her and destroy her as an unnecessary witness. Her security, fragile and illusory, was tied to Seo-jun's stability and power. Without him, she had no chance. Rational fear forced her to think with cold clarity. Hating Seo-jun was a luxury she couldn't afford. As long as he was in power, even if he was her jailer, there were rules. Harsh ones, but rules nonetheless. Ha-jun was chaos, and he would wipe her off the face of the earth just in case. She didn't go to the port. It was too dangerous and pointless. Instead, she went to the only place that could still provide information, the back alley of the former market where her mother once shopped. Old men who remembered her as a child and disliked the new order still worked there. For a bottle of sochu, they told her that recently, young men in expensive jackets had been showing too much interest not in logistics, but in security firms and problem teams that could be hired for one-off jobs. And that all this activity revolved around a single date, the very one Minji remembered. Meanwhile, Seo-jun, having isolated himself from everyone, finally forced himself to do what he'd been avoiding. He re-examined Ha-jun's file with frantic meticulousness, not as an offended man, but as a criminal analyst. And he stumbled upon a discrepancy. Mr. An's testimony had been perfect. Too perfect. Every phrase had been carefully crafted and pointed directly to Minji as the conscious agent. That doesn't happen in real life. People get confused, remember things inaccurately, and give inconsistent testimony. But here was a complete story. He summoned a man from his cybersecurity department, a quiet guy who didn't belong to any clans. Check Mr. An's phone records for the last 3 months, all incoming and outgoing, and find him, quietly. The results arrived within 24 hours. A week before Ha-jun brought the file, An's phone had received several calls from a phantom number purchased with a fake passport. But most importantly, the day before his voluntary testimony, and received 5 calls from the same number, Lee Ha-jun's. That same night, Mr. An himself was brought to Seo-jun. The old man was scared half to death. Upon seeing his boss, he immediately confessed everything. He threatened my granddaughter. He said I had to say whatever he dictated, about the money, about the connections. Otherwise, I didn't mean to, Mr. Park, I swear. She simply took the money when her mother was dying. Nothing more. The truth, plain and ugly, crashed down on Seo-jun with all its weight. He wasn't mistaken about it. He was mistaken about whom he trusted. He was blinded by jealousy and resentment, and Ha-jun exploited it masterfully. He betrayed the only person who saw him as more than just a boss. and now he might be too late. The thought that he was too late gave way to a chilling realization. If Ha-jun had resorted to such an elaborate scheme to eliminate Minji, his goal wasn't simply her elimination. His goal was power, and the current operation in Busan was the perfect target. Seo-jun immediately canceled all meetings and immersed himself in analyzing the upcoming deal. Every detail now seemed like a trap. The route was risky but profitable. That was true, but that was precisely why failure would be devastating. He summoned the few men whose loyalty was beyond doubt and ordered them to conduct a quiet background check on everyone involved in the operations planning. The answer came quickly. Ha-jun had been actively protecting the plan from any changes in recent days, convincing everyone of its reliability while quietly replacing key members of the cargo escort team with his own. It became clear the attack would happen, and it would look like Seo-jun's failure. His authority would crumble, and Ha-jun would be there to pick up the pieces. Seo-jun had 2 days. A direct confrontation now would split the organization in half and lead to the bloodshed he wanted to avoid. He needed a surprise move. And for that move, he needed an outsider. A person everyone considered remote and helpless. A person who knew his world but was not part of it. A person he had betrayed and who probably hated him more than anyone in the world. Late that evening, sitting in his office in complete darkness, Seo-jun dialed a number. Not hers, that was most likely bugged. He called the phone of an old waiter from Sunsu, Mr. Park, whose loyalty to Minji he had indirectly verified through the same cyber specialist. He knew Park would surely know how to contact her. Park-san, he said when the phone on the other end was picked up. This is Park Seo-jun. Don't hang up. I know where she is. Tell her just one thing. He knows the truth about Anya. He needs help. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the park by the old mill. She will be safe, or we're all done for. He hung up without waiting for an answer. It was a desperate move. The chances of her coming were 1 in 100. But he had no other choice. He was betting everything, including his life, on the belief that her desire to survive and her hatred for Ha-jun would be stronger than her hatred for him. He wasn't mistaken in Mr. Park's loyalty. An hour later, a text message from an unknown number arrived on his secure phone, known only to a handful of people. Just one word. Why? Seo-jun clutched the phone in his hand. He typed out a reply, deleting and rewriting it several times. Ha-jun is plotting a coup during the Busan operation. He'll kill me, and then he'll find you. I know how to stop him, but I need your eyes and your stealth. You're the only one he won't wait for. Not for me, for himself and his Sunsu. I'll return it to you if I survive. Meeting, 10 a.m., alone. There was no answer. But the next morning, precisely at 10 o'clock, in a secluded park near an old abandoned mill, Minji stood, wrapped in a simple dark cloak. Her face was pale and inscrutable. Seo-jun approached her. He looked exhausted but collected. Thank you for coming. I didn't come for you, she replied coldly. You're right about Ha-jun. What should I do? He appreciated her directness. The time for apologies and explanations was over. The operation is in a day. The cargo is coming in 4 containers. Ha-jun has replaced the security. His men will stage a competitor attack and steal the cargo. I need to know the exact place and time. My men can't follow. He knows them by sight. But yours, not you. Which my men? She asked skeptically. Your suppliers, Seo-jun said. Fishermen from the coast, truck drivers from the market, small shopkeepers. They're invisible to the likes of Ha-jun. They see everything. I need their network of eyes and ears along the entire coast from Incheon to Busan by the day after tomorrow, to catch him red-handed at the moment of the attack. Minji looked at him, assessing him. The plan was insane, and the only possible one. And what will I get? First, security. Second, Sunsu. Clean, debt-free. Officially registered to you. I'll prepare the paperwork today. And how will I pay them? These people? I don't have the money. Not with money. Seo-jun shook his head. With a promise. After this is all over, Sunsu will reopen, and they will have an exclusive contract to supply the most famous restaurant in the area. Their business will survive. Tell them that. He saw the calculation flicker in her eyes. She hated him. But she loved her restaurant and the ordinary people who had worked with her family for years. It was a deal she could understand. Okay, she finally said. I'll try, but if this is a trap, then Ha-jun gets us both, he finished for her. And he wants that very much. He handed her a burner phone and an envelope containing a large sum of cash for operating expenses. Coordinate through this. Destroy it afterward. I'll contact you tomorrow evening. She took the phone and the envelope, nodded, and without saying goodbye, turned around and quickly walked away, disappearing between the trees. He watched her go. The risk was colossal, but for the first time in weeks, he felt not heaviness, but clarity. He had made a bet. Clarity was priceless. Returning to her closet, Minji took the money out of the envelope and set it aside. First, she pulled out her old phone and began calling familiar numbers. Without explaining the details, she spoke in her mother's voice, firm and begging for trust. Uncle Cho, this is Minji. Remember how my mother always bought the freshest flounder from you? I need your help now. I need eyes on the port and the roads to Busan the day after tomorrow. Nothing illegal. Just a lookout and a word for the future of Sunsu. For all of us. She called fishermen, drivers, and owners of small roadside eateries. She didn't pay them. She reminded them of their debt of honor to her mother and gave them hope for future contracts. In her world, among the little people, this worked better than money. By evening, she had a shadowy but vast network of 20 people, ready to keep an eye out. Meanwhile, Seo-jun was operating in his own reality. He summoned 2 of his most trusted fighters and assigned them to invisible protection for Minji without informing her. He couldn't risk her anymore. At the same time, he began secretly transporting his real, proven team to Busan, not to protect the cargo, but to surround the site of the future attack and catch Ha-jun's men red-handed. He was playing along, allowing the traitor's plan to unfold. The day of the operation arrived. Minji drifted like a ghost between the fishing huts and eateries along the coast, receiving fragmentary messages. Her phone buzzed with short, terse text messages. I see 3 black vans parked 5 kilometers from the Busan interchange, license plates obscured. There's a group of non-locals at Pier 3. They look like security guards, but they're acting nervous. A truck with containers just passed the checkpoint, traveling along the planned route. 2 cars behind it in the distance. She transmitted everything to Seo-jun via a secure channel, filtering the information. She became his eyes where his own blindness nearly destroyed him. Seo-jun, receiving her messages, adjusted the positioning of his men. He saw the picture Ha-jun was constructing. Vans to intercept, men at the pier to receive the stolen goods, diversionary maneuvers on the roads. It was a complex, well-thought-out operation, and it was unfolding right before his eyes, thanks to the woman he'd kicked out the door. An hour before the estimated time of the attack, Minji sent the final, most important message. The old fisherman says there's a new group at the abandoned warehouse on the shore, 3 kilometers from Point C. 6 men. One of them, in a leather jacket, is giving orders. Looks like your man. This isn't an interception point, it's a backup, or an emergency exit. Seo-jun froze. Ha-jun was smarter than he thought. He'd prepared not only the attack, but also a retreat route with the supplies in case something went wrong. Without this information, his men could miss their main target. Changing focus, he quietly ordered his team over the radio. The primary target is the abandoned warehouse on the shore. Protect the civilians in the area. They're ours. Seo-jun's order refocused the entire operation. His men, hiding in the industrial area, began a silent advance toward the abandoned warehouse, leaving the main road under surveillance by a small group. Minji, after receiving his curt, "Stay away from the warehouse," knew the end was near. She was in a tiny diner 2 kilometers away. The owner, Uncle Cho, was nervously glancing out the window. Suddenly, he turned to her. Minji, several cars just sped past. Looks like a chase. There will be gunfire. She glanced at the map on the wall. The warehouse was too close. Seo-jun had asked her to stay away, but if his men lost Ha-jun, it would all be for nothing. He could escape and start all over again. The thought was unbearable. Uncle Cho, give me your old grocery truck, she said firmly. Are you crazy? I need to create some noise. A distraction. For 10 minutes. She didn't wait for permission. Grabbing the keys hanging on a nail, she ran out into the yard. 5 minutes later, an old battered truck with a sign reading "Fresh Vegetables" was rumbling along the dirt road leading directly to the rear entrance of the warehouse. Meanwhile, a brief, furious firefight had already broken out at the warehouse. Seo-jun's men had caught the guards off guard, but apparently there was a significant force inside. Ha-jun had prepared himself. Hearing the gunshots, Minji stepped on the gas. She drove into the compound, honking her horn like a lost driver. Her truck crashed with a roar into a pile of rusty barrels at the back of the warehouse. "Hey, what's going on here? Help! My brakes failed!" she screamed, jumping out of the cab and waving her arms. For a few seconds, the gunfire died down. Several of Ha-Jun's men at the rear entrance turned around, disoriented by this absurd spectacle. That second was enough for Seo-jun's men. Two of them knocked down the guards, opening the way inside. Ha-Jun burst out of the warehouse door. He saw her. His face twisted with rage and understanding. "You!" he roared, raising his pistol. But the shot didn't come from his direction. The bullet pierced his shoulder, causing him to drop his weapon. From the other side, Seo-jun emerged from around the corner. A smoking pistol was pointed at the lieutenant. "It's over, Ha-Jun," Seo-jun said in an icy voice. "Your men are surrounded. The cargo is safe." Ha-Jun, writhing in pain, laughed. "You've lost, boss. Even if you take me, the organization doesn't trust you anymore. They saw how you lost your nerve because of this." He spat in Minji's direction. "Then I'll talk to them without you," Seo-jun replied, gesturing for his men to subdue and take away the former lieutenant. When the commotion died down, he approached Minji. She was leaning against the truck, shaking with adrenaline. "I said stay away," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only silent amazement. "Did it work?" she asked, looking him straight in the eye. "Yes," he nodded. "It worked. Thank you." They stood amidst the chaos in the smell of gunpowder and rust, victors in a battle neither of them wanted. But the cost of this victory for Seo-jun was now clear. He looked at her pale but determined face, at the old truck smashed into the barrels. This was her world, a world where problems were solved with a horn, the loyalty of old friends, and a willingness to risk everything for what was dear. His world lay in ruins, the betrayal of his right-hand man, a rift within the organization, the need to prove his strength again and again. And she stood at the center of this storm, the one he himself had brought here. "Take her out of here," he quietly ordered one of his drivers, "a safe route, and stay with her until I say so." "I don't need security," Minji answered immediately. "I do right now." His voice brooked no argument, but there was no order in it, only a tired necessity. "Ha-Jun didn't act alone. Until I deal with everyone, you're in danger. Please." She saw responsibility, not control, in his eyes. And she nodded. When the car carrying Minji disappeared from sight, Seo-jun turned to his guard captain. "Clean up everything here, lock up the living, the dead, as usual, and summon all the elders for a council." This very evening, the council was held in that very mansion. The atmosphere was oppressive. The elders, some of whom secretly supported Ha-Jun, regarded Seo-jun with cold wariness. He had won the skirmish but lost the trust. Seo-jun didn't bother making excuses. He placed the recorder on the table. He played the recording, where Ha-Jun, now under pressure, detailed his coup plan, naming those who had connived at him or promised support. A dead silence fell over the room. "I eliminated the threat," Seo-jun said, his voice even and emotionless, "but I also saw the root of the problem. It's me. Or rather, the system I inherited. A system where power is based on fear and loyalty is bought and sold. Where a man like Ha-Jun sees betrayal as a logical step." He glanced around the room. "I'm leaving." A murmur of confusion swept through the hall. One of the elders jumped to his feet. "Are you giving up? After victory?" "This isn't a victory." Seo-jun cut him off sharply. "This is a dead end. I don't want to be a stone in this wall anymore. I'm tired of this life. And I can't bring—" He paused, but everyone understood who he was talking about. "I'll legalize every possible asset," he continued. "The rest I'll dissolve or hand over to you for division. I'll destroy the criminal part of my father's empire with my own hands. With my testimony, with my data. I'll leave, but before I go, I'll burn the bridges so no one can cross them." It wasn't an escape. It was a self-destructive attack. But it was the only way to escape the cage and give a chance to life to the one he had trapped within it. "Are you mad? You will destroy us all," someone shouted. "No," Seo-jun retorted coldly. "I will destroy only the shadow. Those who choose to remain in the shadows will burn with it. Those who choose to come into the light will have a chance. The choice is yours." He walked out of the hall, leaving chaos behind him. His choice was made. The price was his past, his power, his name. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward, not just deeper into the tunnel. When the decision was made, before he could put his plan into action, he needed to see her. One last time. He arrived at her new, temporary refuge, a small apartment he'd rented for her through a proxy. It was already past midnight. He knocked, and she opened the door, still dressed, as if she'd been waiting, or couldn't sleep. They stood facing each other in the cramped corridor. The air between them vibrated with everything unspoken. "I've made a choice," he said quietly, unable to tear his eyes away from her. "Which one?" Her voice was no louder than a whisper. "I'm leaving, and to leave forever, I need to destroy what held me back. My father's entire empire, the criminal part of it. I'll hand over the data to the authorities. I'll become a traitor in the eyes of those who remain in the shadows." She was silent, understanding the full scale of the sacrifice. This wasn't just a change of power. It was the self-destruction of his old self. "Why?" she finally breathed out. "You could have simply left." "And left you here, with Ha-Jun's shadow and those who would seek revenge?" He stepped closer. The distance between them became dangerous. "And leave my former self? The one who could do this to you?" "No, this has to end. Finally." He raised his hand as if to touch her face, but stopped a centimeter away. "When I stood there, in that warehouse, and saw you running out of that stupid truck, I wasn't afraid for the operation. I was afraid for you, to the point of losing my pulse, and I realized I can't do this anymore. I can't be the reason you're afraid, even if it means stopping being myself." There was more than determination in his eyes. There was pain, regret, and something that took her breath away. "You will return, Sun Tzu," he continued, lowering his hand. "Pure, and I will leave you enough so you will never know want again. That's all I can give. In exchange for everything." Minji looked at him. The hatred and resentment were still there, smoldering embers, but something else was growing over them, a sharp, aching understanding. "Will you disappear?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, I have to, until it's all over. Until my past stops trailing behind me like a train." He took a step back, toward the door, breaking this unbearable closeness. "Forgive me for everything." He turned to leave, but her hand suddenly grabbed his wrist. The light but firm touch burned his skin. "Stay alive," she whispered, not looking him in the eyes, but looking at his hand in hers. "Promise, stay alive. Otherwise this escape will be worthless." He turned. Their gazes met. There was no forgiveness in her eyes, but there was something more powerful in that moment, a refusal to let him go to his death. It wasn't a kiss, not a hug. It was a fragile thread she stretched across the chasm between them. "I promise," he said hoarsely, and it was the most honest word he had spoken in many years. He kept his word. The following months became a time of quiet, methodical destruction. Through his trusted lawyers and using incriminating evidence gathered over the years, Seo-jun began the process. He didn't simply flee, he orchestrated a controlled collapse. Key criminal schemes were carefully leaked to law enforcement through anonymous channels. The rivals he had once suppressed suddenly gained an advantage. His own organization, leaderless and under attack from both within and without, began to disintegrate into warring factions, which quickly came under police scrutiny or were absorbed by others. Through shell funds, he transferred legitimate assets, real estate, business shares, to Minji's name. The largest transfer was to Sun Tzu. The restaurant wasn't simply repaid. Debts were paid off, the building was repurchased, and the account received a sum sufficient for a complete renovation and several years of profit-free operation. One morning, Minji found an envelope in her mailbox. It contained the keys to Sun Tzu, the title deeds, and a plain white card, unsigned. Written on it were just 3 words. "He's yours now." She opened a restaurant. It was hard at first. Memories weighed heavily on her, but she did what she did best: cooked. Gradually, Sun Tzu came alive again. Her mother's memory was no longer burdened by debt and fear. She expanded the business, opening 2 more establishments under the same name. The Sun Tzu restaurant chain became successful and respected. She kept her promise to her old suppliers, and their business flourished. She built a new life, strong, independent, pure. But in the evenings, when the lights went out in the final room, She would sometimes go to the window and look out onto the empty street. She didn't know if he was alive. She didn't know where he was. The news occasionally flashed reports of the dismantling of major criminal groups, arrests, but his name was never mentioned. He had disappeared, as he had promised. He had burned his bridges. And only one day, exactly 3 years later, did the chef at the flagship Sunsu receive an order. Not through the website, but via old-fashioned fax. It included a delivery address, a secluded villa in the mountains outside the city, and a precise list of dishes. Clear chicken noodle soup, fried rice with vegetables, and several panchans. Under special requests, it read, no Sichuan pepper, and for Chef Kim to deliver personally. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew this menu. It was dinner on the very night it all began. Minji didn't delegate the order to anyone. She prepared everything herself, with the same care as always, though her hands trembled slightly. She packed the food in simple, high-quality containers, got into her car, and drove to the specified address. The road wound into the mountains. The villa, when she arrived, was modern but modest, almost invisible among the pines. No security, no high fences, only silence and the scent of pine needles. She picked up the bag of food and walked to the door. Before she could ring the doorbell, the door opened. He stood in the doorway. Park Seo-jun, but not the one she knew. He wore simple dark pants and a sweater, his hair a little longer, his face tanned and calmer. The icy wall of his eyes was gone. There was only a deep, almost painful intentness with which he looked at her, as if afraid she would crumble. They stood in the doorway in silence. The only sound was the wind in the branches. You have arrived, he finally said, and his voice sounded unusually quiet, without its previous commanding tone. You ordered, she replied, picking up her bag. Her own voice seemed strange to her. Yes, come in. He stepped back, letting her in. The interior was bright and minimalist. Nothing superfluous. Plates and cutlery for one were already set on the living room table. Sit down, he said. Eat with me. I already ate, she lied automatically. Minji, he called her by name as if it were a spell. Please, at least try the soup. You know I can't eat alone. She sat down slowly across from him. He plated the food, his movements precise but no longer theatrical. He poured her soup. The aroma rose into the air, familiar and suddenly achingly dear. He took the first sip and closed his eyes. The same, he whispered. Exactly the same. She picked up her spoon. The broth tasted perfect, her own. But at that moment, she felt not the chef's pride, but something else, a piercing, sharp sensation that brought a lump to her throat. Where have you been? She asked, unable to bear it any longer. Everywhere and nowhere. He put down his spoon. I watched how you built your empire, how Sunsu grew. I was proud of you, more proud than I've ever been of myself. It was hard, she said, looking at her plate. I know, and I couldn't be there. I'm sorry, but it was the only way. I had to be sure they weren't coming for me, that they wouldn't come for you. He paused. It's over, Minji. The old life. My old enemies are either in prison or have destroyed each other. All that's left is this, me, and I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the boss. I'm just Seo-jun, if you'll allow me. He extended his hand across the table, not touching her, simply placing it palm up next to her plate. It was a question, and an offer, and a request for forgiveness, all in one gesture. Minji looked at his hand, at the scars that weren't there before, at the silence that now surrounded him. She placed her hand on top of his fingers closed around her palm, carefully, as if afraid to hurt. There was no need to say anything else. The food on the table was getting cold, but the room finally felt warm. They sat like that, holding hands across the table until the soup stopped steaming. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with something. All the unspoken, all the pain, all the anticipation of these 3 years. What now? She asked quietly, finally looking up at him. Are you just going to live here, in the mountains, alone? I was hoping, not alone. His fingers tightened their grip on hers. But I'm not asking for anything. You've built your life. It's beautiful. If you want to leave, I'll understand. You've already given me more than I deserve. Minji slowly pulled her hand from his. He cringed, taking that for an answer. But she simply stood, walked around the table, and sat next to him on the sofa, facing him. "You were wrong then," she said bluntly. And I was furious. I thought I'd never be able to forget it. But these 3 years, I haven't forgotten. I remembered the worst, and then what came after. You don't deserve my forgiveness, but I think I'm ready to give it, if you're willing to wait for it to be complete. He looked at her, and hope flashed in his eyes, so bright and fragile that she was afraid of it. "I'm ready to wait the rest of my life," he whispered. "I've learned patience." She smiled for the first time that evening, a small, hesitant smile. "Then, for starters, stop eating alone. Sunsu has a private terrace overlooking the garden. A very private place. For special guests." He nodded, unable to speak. This wasn't the end of the story. This was a new, uncertain beginning. But their past, even burned away, left lingering shadows. A few weeks later, when Seo-jun first came to Sunsu as an ordinary, albeit very welcome guest, Minji noticed a car parked outside for far too long. Nothing out of the ordinary, but her nerves, honed by the past, were on edge. That same evening, an email arrived in her inbox from an address she didn't recognize. There was no text, just one old, slightly blurry photograph. It showed a young Seo-jun, about 20 years old, on some pier, and next to him an older man with a dragon tattoo on his neck. Minji had only seen this man once, briefly, at one of their earliest meetings at the mansion. It wasn't Ha-jun, it was one of his father's old guard, one of those everyone thought had disappeared or died in the fighting. Attached to the email was an audio file, just 3 seconds long, a distorted electronic voice uttering a single word, "Debts." The two of them sat in her office above the restaurant, hearing that word over and over again. Their truce, their fragile happiness, was shattered. Seo-jun put the phone down on the table, his face hard, but not frightened. "Old. This is Choi, the dragon. He was my father's right-hand man. I thought he was dead. Apparently, I was wrong. Some debts," he looked at her, "cannot be paid with money, only with blood." Minji placed her hand over his clenched fist. "You used to fight alone," she said firmly. "Not anymore. You showed me how to destroy empires, and I showed you how to survive in the shadows. Perhaps it's time to combine our lessons?" He met her gaze. There was no fear in her eyes. There was determination. They were no longer boss and cook. They weren't even just lovers. They had become allies, bound by a common battle and a common future. And an enemy from the past had just made it clear to them that this battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Again. But this time, they would fight together. He unclenched his fist beneath her palm, his fingers intertwining with hers. The strength of her grip surprised him. It wasn't fragility, but a solid hold. "He won't come with threats head-on," Seo-jun said quietly, his analytical mind already working, assessing the threat. "The dragon is cunning. He's been watching all these years, and he chose the moment when I showed a weakness, something I could lose." "I'm not a weakness," Minji corrected him, and her voice took on the steely notes he knew from her kitchen during the days of open rebellion. "I'm your backbone. I have a legitimate business, connections, respect, and I know every path around Sunsu. He's from your past, and we are the present, and the future." He looked up at her, the shadow of the old, lonely heaviness slowly dissolving in his eyes. Her words weren't empty bravado. She was offering a strategy. Her world, a world of legitimate supplies, trusted people, public recognition, could be their best armor and weapon. "He'll target you," he warned. "Not me. To force me out of the shadows." "Then let him try." Minji shrugged, that same defiant glint at the corner of her lips that had once made him see something more in her. "Sungsu has excellent security, and the best lawyers in the city whom I hired after the Ha-jun incident. My restaurants aren't just kitchens, they're fortresses, and I've learned to protect what's mine." Seo-jun allowed himself to smile, genuinely for the first time this difficult evening. He saw more than just a brave woman. He saw a partner, an equal. "So, the plan?" he asked. "The plan is simple." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of her restaurant below. "You stay in the shadows, my shadow. You are my security consultant, and I am your legal life. We will make the dragon play on our field, in a world of papers, contracts, and public reputation. And when he makes a mistake and shows his fangs, she turned to him and her gaze was merciless and clear. Then you will do what you do best. Finish this. Finally. But not alone anymore. He stood up and walked over to her, standing next to her, following her gaze to the lights below. Their reflections in the glass almost merged into one. Together, he said, and the word became a new oath, stronger than all the previous ones. Together, she confirmed. Outside, the night city lived its own life, unaware that in the quiet office above the restaurant, a new alliance had just been born. Not out of fear or calculation, but out of choice. The choice to stand together, despite the past and despite a dangerous future. They looked at the lights below, at her world, which he had helped build, and at his past, which would now forever be part of their shared history. And it was scary and difficult and incredibly right. A threatening phone lay silent on the table. Let the old enemies return. Now they'll have to deal with both of them,